today we're going to be talking about solutions engineering and best practices and some things that we've learned along the way to building industry applications. So, well, before that, I guess I'll introduce myself. I am Elise. I am leading the solutions team, the solutions engineering team at Decisions. And so essentially, my job is managing the folks on the team and planting seeds and helping grow tomato and pear. Ben?
Hey guys, my name is Benjamin Weatherford. I've been with Solutions for about 4 years. On the Solutions team, I am the solutions architect, so it's my role to make sure that we follow best practices. I help with the design, I help with some other research for each of these solutions that we've been building. So,
we are credible, I swear. No, I was kidding. But we're going to cover a couple of topics today.
Do you want to?
Yeah,
okay.
Take it.
So some of the topics we'll be covering today is our application breakdown. That's going to be our first topic today. So what we want to do is when you've got a monolithic application, you really want to say, well, how can I actually break this into chunk-sized pieces that I can develop against? This is really what you want to be focused on. Our second thing we're going to be looking at is no-code reviews. No-code reviews, same as with traditional development, you really actually do need to do some review work. So am I getting feedback on the?
No, yeah, it sounds good.
All right. So for no-code reviews, we want to make sure that when we deliver our solutions, that they are as high quality as we can possibly make them. They follow and maintain the best practices at Decisions. And the same goes with application testing. On application testing, we want to make sure that when we deliver our solutions, they're also battle tested and hardened. So they've gone through the ringer. They've had load testing done against them, stress testing done against them, and they have plenty of unit tests that can be performed. Oh, I'm sorry. And then the fourth one is process abstraction. So if any of you attended Jason's session yesterday on data-driven design, you'll know that he's discussed how we can use data to impact and manipulate what processes we undergo. So this is something that we've used in a few of our solutions. So we're going to go over a couple of examples of how we've used data-driven designs in our solutions.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, application breakdown, or as Ben mentioned, we're going to be covering how to break down a large, complex application that you're building into a more manageable way. But before we cover some of these things, I want to provide a little bit of color to the solutions engineering team, right? We were a team that was formed back in May of 2020. And at that time, we were under the sales organization and the sales umbrella, and we were building what we call candidate processes. These candidates were really generic, cross-industry type of applications that were meant to be templates or end-to-end applications to go into our app store for our customers. Obviously we took a pivot from that, and what we're doing is focusing on end-to-end applications for financial services and healthcare. And these will not be in the app store, right? These are going to be independent application and products of Decisions. But there was a lot of things that we learned along the way of building candidates and of starting with the solutions team. We want to share some of those things, not all of them because it would take all day, but we wanted to share some of those things and hopefully help you to build large, complex applications as well. So firstly, functional decomposition is something we're going to cover. I think I'll just go right into it. This is really just a structured way of breaking down your process into, capabilities or functions, right? We did this exercise, and this has been something that we've been utilizing in our roadmaps, our project management, as well as things like user mapping or user journey mapping. So it's been a really helpful tool, but with loan origination, it is something that we knew we wanted to do. So we started there, but we didn't quite know what to start building first, right? That was something that we struggled with, and I think, with solutions, we don't have a customer that we're building for necessarily, right? We have a thing that we know we want to build and a product owner, right? A subject matter expert. But we didn't necessarily have a customer to build for, so there wasn't necessarily requirements that were coming in, right? There weren't a list of things that we were supposed to start with. So what we did was we sat down as a team, product owner, manager, developers. We sat together and we started to discuss some of the things that are in loan origination specifically, right? We knew that loan origination had generally outreach, application, processing, blah, 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 right? So we sat down together and discussed these things, and then we divided out into sub-functions, right? Loan origination was the basic function, the sub-functions being yellow, and then the sub-sub-function. So, this exercise that you do with your own team can actually be even divided further. But once we had the sub-functions and the general modules to build, what we started to do was highlight what is it that decisions would do well and what do we want to build and incorporate within our product. So, keeping the minimum viable product in mind, or the MVP, we started highlighting specific modules that we knew decisions would be good at doing, as well as the things we wanted to solve for our customers. So that's kind of the result of loan origination and iterating on a diagram.
And that's also what Elise just said, is why we wanted to collaborate. Because as nice as it is to have a product owner, your product owner doesn't necessarily understand decisions capabilities. They don't necessarily understand what is a bread and butter thing for decisions to do. And that's why it's so important to be able to collaborate and not just have a product owner, but also the developers who know decisions like the back of their hand as to what they can reasonably build in the platform.
Yeah, and I will say, if you do Google functional decomposition, right, you might see things like it's not volatile or not easily evolved, right? But I don't think that's true because the iteration, step number 5, is important. You can come back to it. You can add new portions of your module as you're discovering new parts in an agile type of environment. Now, I think I had another thing to say about loan origination, or the functional decomposition. As I mentioned, we are using this within our roadmap, user journey mapping, and several other places, and it's been really helpful for our development team to understand the application as a whole that we're building and to cast that vision. So another thing that we learned and we wanted to share was that you should get a project manager, right? Before, what we were doing was project management, sure, it counts, but we weren't really following any sort of framework, right? Now, we decided and we knew that we wanted to work in an agile Scrum methodology. But I will say, having a dedicated person, a dedicated project manager to the thing that you're building changes the whole scope of the project and the management of the project. The project manager should not be a developer. It should not be a developer manager, right? It should be a person who is solely dedicated to maintaining and tracking the project. They could be a part of several projects, but this person should be, helping to maintain and plan out the project. Like I said, we knew we wanted to work in Agile and Scrum, but I'm a firm believer that these are guidelines, right? Scrum is a guideline as to how your team should function. You might have to adjust the Scrum framework or the Agile methodology for your organization or for your team, but this is what worked for us. So I'm going to walk through a couple of the things that we do on our team that helps us be agile, helps us build applications and build it to good scope. So planning, that's pretty self-explanatory, but planning we actually do in combination with our retrospective. And I'll come back to that in just a bit. But once we have our sprint planned, what we do is we work in 2-week sprints, and we have a daily scrum associated with it. So our daily scrum, we get together, we say, what did we work on? What do we need to work on? Are there any problems, right? One thing that's a little bit different is the backlog refinement. This is something that we do generally around the middle of the sprint, but traditionally, product owners are the ones that groom the backlog, right? Make those changes. What we do is we not only have the product owner, but we also have the developers participating with the grooming so that we can address things like any questions that might be had from the development side. Are there any additional collateral that needs to be created from the product owner, right? Things like wireframes, things like wireframes.
Criteria.
What? Acceptance criteria, right? We define all those things during the backlog refinement, and we do it together as a team. Next, we have the business reviews. That's pretty standard, right? We have it with the stakeholder. We review what we built in that sprint, and we get some feedback. Lastly, retrospective. I say lastly because I'll get there why, get to the why, but retrospective, we do this with the planning, right? But the retrospective, we talk about what we could do better in this sprint. What are the things that didn't go well? What did go well? And, it allows us to kind of have more synergy with the team, but also understand what we need to do better. We'll get to no code reviews in a bit. We're going to cover this in a little bit more detail. But last but not least, deployment. I don't have a lot to say here because solutions engineering has not yet gone to deployment yet, right? There's still going to be a lot of things that we're going to learn here, and hopefully those things will be things that we share at the next Decisions Days.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about prototyping. Something to note here is whenever we're given a application that we need to build out, or wherever we want to start on a solution, the first place we like to start is to try to prototype something. The reason for that is, well, manyfold. The first being, we want to get executive buy-in. The reason for that is, starting a full application is a monumental task. So being able to start with some small piece of functionality, some MVP that you can actually go in, create a demo, and be able to show to your stakeholders and say, hey, take a look at this. This is something that we can actually do in our platform. We can do it well, and if we want to be able to build out a full application using this as our initial demonstratable prototype. When you get that executive buy-in, that really gives you all the resources that you typically need in order to continue on with your project. But beyond that, the prototyping phase is huge. The reason, again, is not just the executive buy-in, but also getting your hands on the initial tool and the initial build-out is monumental. Show of hands, who here has developed in Decisions? Almost everybody on this side of the room. Who here has started developing in Decisions and then at some point in the future said, I wish I designed that a little bit differently? Almost everybody on this side of the room. The thing is, when we start to develop something, and this is not just Decisions explicit, when you start to develop things, we start to see some of the cracks in our initial ideas, our initial planning. And if we let those things go unaddressed, if we just try to start a build out and we don't address those concerns, we start to accrue this technical debt. This technical debt that, if it's not addressed, is something that in 6 months' time, in a year's time, starts to become this huge thorn in our sides for any of the future development that we need to do. So when we do a prototype, it lets us do a quick initial build out that we intend to scrap, that we intend to just use as our quick baseline for proving out an idea, for proving out a concept. But it also lets us get our hands on the tools so that we know, oh, actually, while we were building this, we found out it didn't really look all that maintainable, or it didn't look all that scalable. Or we get through those initial ideas, those design choices, and we say, okay, actually, this time when we've got approval, but this time when we actually start the build, we're gonna make some tweaks. We're gonna make some changes to better fit what we think is a better design choice later on. So the prototyping gives us that opportunity to kind of create a proof of concept of the actual build out that we wanna do. On top of that, again, with the executive buy-in, the prototype also acts as kind of a proof, or I'm sorry, it gives us the opportunity to start doing research. So a real example that I'm going to give you guys is PAIR. When we started on PAIR, which is our clinical measures, our clinical trials prototype, our clinical trial solution, we started going around it, we started looking at how we could prototype things, and then we had to stop. And the reason we had to stop is because we took a look at our task. We took a look at the things that we had groomed and we needed to get done. And just looking at this task, we had a really hard time sizing them, or setting descriptions, or setting acceptance criteria. And the reason for that is, as badly as we wanted to get started building, we weren't there yet. We didn't understand what we were trying to build. And on top of that, we didn't know what we didn't know. So we said, let's stop here. And that's why Spike is up here as well. What we did is we took a few sprints and we said, these are gonna be our spike periods. We're gonna just do research. We're not gonna try to build anything. We don't know what we're trying to build. All we're gonna do is go learn about the industry, the application, and what we need to figure out to do, to actually create a real prototype. It's really easy to get kind of caught up in this idea of we have deadlines. You have to know, we have to get this done by next week. We have to get this done by next month. But if you don't know what you're building, you're gonna build garbage and you're gonna waste your time. That's the honest truth of it. And so we had to stop for PAIR. We had to take a couple sprints. We had to reevaluate. We had to go start doing our research, medical coding systems, how the industry works for clinical trials, how clinicaltrials.gov does it, what kind of experts we have, what services are available, XYZ. So many things that we had to actually go and dig into to find out more about before we could even begin our prototyping phase.
Yeah, and with the spikes, they are incorporated within the sprint. And with prototyping, it's different from our 2-week sprints that we were just talking about. We take about a week worth of time. We have 1-week sprints to basically build out the prototype, right? There can be several sprints, but the reason why we do that is because we're able to address things much quicker, right? If it's 2 weeks, you're building something much larger in a larger scale. 1-week sprints allow you to kind of build something quickly and be able to look at it, address it, and hopefully build the prototype in a shorter amount of time. Also, in the decisions world, I see this as our POCs, right? If you come through decisions and you're looking to purchase, right, this is essentially what we're building from the sales engineering side, is a prototype. Does it work? And is it viable for you as a customer? Is it viable for your organization? What we're doing with the building, once we determine viability, that's kind of like the PS projects and the engagements, or if you're building it out yourself. So just, putting some color and context for, a process that you might have gone through with coming to decisions and purchasing us.
Another thing that we've done at the start of our solutions is user journey mapping. And so user journey mapping is, again, similar to real, normal development work, where we say, let's go ahead and take a look at what roles are going to be involved in our application. Who are our end users? Who's going to be using this thing? And so for Tomato specifically, if we go ahead and take a look at this slide, for Tomato, we have some cute alliteration for each of these different roles. We've created these personas: borrower Barry, and loan officer Laura, and
risk
underwriter
manager
Andy
Richard,
doesn't count.
yeah.
Risk manager Richard. And we've got these personas, and the big thing that we're asking ourselves as we go through these personas is, what information do they need? What actions can they take? What are the things that they need to be able to do to interact with our application? And so by doing this exercise, we're able to create a diagram where we're going through the full timeline of an end-to-end application, and we're setting aside these individual personas, and we're defining what they can do. This helps us when we're trying to create our user stories for our sprints, but it also allows us to kind of get a good overall big picture of everybody involved in the process and what they're doing at any point in time.
Yeah, this has been something that has helped our development team understand our requirements, but also to take a step back from thinking about, well, how do I build it, right? They start to think about borrower Barry and the things that he needs and the things that he wants, and incorporate that within our backlog refinement and some of our planning exercises. What we don't have shown on this slide is the actual journey mapping that we've done. We've incorporated the functional decomposition that we talked about, as well as understanding from start to finish what it exactly each one of these users needs in the application.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to no-code reviews. So we're going to go ahead and switch gears a little bit here. So again, the purpose of these no-code reviews is to maintain our quality as we're building, because realistically, we always want to make sure that when somebody comes behind us, that they can understand what we're building. And on top of that, that when we deliver our product, that it maintains that standard that is expected of us.
Just curious, how many people have built-in decisions already, or are new users to decisions, I should say, have been building for less than 6 months?
These are all experienced.
Okay, so everybody's experienced.
Everybody over on this side is experienced or haven't used it.
Okay, so then we'll talk about the pyramid of success, and I'll let you cover that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we called this the pyramid of success. We didn't call it the pyramid of no-code review because that's a mouthful and not a great name. Success is awesome. Anyways, all right, so we're going to actually start kind of the opposite way around. I want to start with element level, which is the foundation of this pyramid. So in decisions, when we do a no-code review, we want to start at the element level. The element level is the individual atomic component that you're configuring. So this is your flows, your rules, your dashboards, your forms. These are the components that you have you create and you configure, and it's that the smallest kind of atomic piece of your application. In project level, this is, again, if you think back to the topology from earlier, these are your bite-sized chunks of development that you're working on, these specific pieces of functionality. This is the second level of code review that we do. And then at the top of the pyramid is the application level. This is the highest viewpoint, the highest level of our no-code reviews. This is where we say, let's take the full end-to-end application and let's go with our business owner and start reviewing things. See what might be missing, see what's potentially wrong with our build, and compare it against our requirements. We're going to go a little bit more in depth than that. So starting on the element level again, and just to reiterate, this your individual components, your flows, your rules, forms, etc. On the solutions team, we have a set of best practices that we want to follow. And it's for the exact same reasons that code reviews are done when you're doing a standard programming job. We want to make sure that, again, somebody can actually use your code, reuse it, and also go back and modify it if they ever need to, or understand it. In decisions, we want to be able to do the same thing. So we have a set of standards. Our standards are things like when you create a flow, or when you create a rule, you write down a description of what that element is doing. This is the same thing as commenting a function inside of some program that you're writing. So we want to define the explicit purpose of that element. On top of that, when you're writing a flow, we want you to rename your steps. If your step is named delete, and I go through and I say, well, what is it deleting? I say, oh, I don't know. Okay, great. What is it creating? What's this? What's fetch entities? What is that actually doing? I don't know. So this is why we rename our steps to be a little bit more contextual to what's going on around us. So that if somebody new joins the team, or if I ever go back 5 months later and review my flow, that I know what's going on. Because otherwise, if it takes me 10 minutes to understand that flow and I've got 150 flows in my application, how long is it going to take me just to try to remember what the heck I was building? It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare, people. But aside from just flow steps, we also rename data names. If anybody's used a fetch entity step, it gives you back entity results. What is that? Is it accounts? Is it groups? What is it? So we rename our data. We rename our steps. We have clean flow lines to where it kind of all of our diagrams when we build in solutions kind of follows the same pattern as when you're reading a book from top left to bottom right. We try to avoid crossing flow lines. I don't know about any of you, but I've seen flows with hundreds of steps in them. They are impossible to look at. They are impossible to follow because they're giant spider webs of just mess, garbage just everywhere. What? Don't look at me. They're your flows. Anyway, sorry. Segue. Would you like to?
Since everyone's a seasoned developer here, right? These are just the best practices that have been taught, right? These are the things that you should know, whether you're, going through training or a PS developer, right? So most of you should already know some of the best practices to follow. But something that is a little bit different from PS or customer best practices and solutions is one of the things that we need to do is update documentation, right? As Heath mentioned before in his roadmap slides, we're going to have our industry applications come with a manual, right? This manual is going to entail things like how to modify something, how to make a change or add something new. So those things need to be documented while we're building them or just after we build them, because 2 months down the line, we're going to totally forget what and how one function of the application is.
Or why we built it that way.
Right.
Yeah.
As you saw, the topology for loan origination is quite large. There's many features and capabilities within each one of those modules that we're going to have to build out. So one of the things that we have to do and be diligent about is updating documentation, and that is a part of our best practice.
And just very quickly, before you move on to the project level, the last thing that I just want to note is that we also do some auxiliary functions as our best practice. So whenever you this isn't about how you configure these individual elements. This is more about how they're kind of aligned within the rest of your project. So if you have a convention that you're using for tagging your elements, this is things like making sure that you have your tags aligned. This is things like making sure that your permissions are set or that things are put into the folder scaffolding correctly. Make sure that they're actually connected to the project that you want them to be connected to. There's a whole host of auxiliary actions to take whenever you design an element that aren't necessarily, again, part of the configuration, but still need to be taken to maintain your project.
Yes.
Going back to your point about documentation and I guess other tasks, do you find that you're more successful when you actually have a named owner for those things, or is it, how has that gone with the evolution of the project to like, hey guys, can somebody update this?
Yeah, so right now we actually have Morgan as an owner for our user manuals. What we do have is kind of two different types of documents. We have the specifications doc, which kind of help guide what we're building over time. And then we also have the user manuals, which is what our end users will be delivered, right? So Morgan is the owner of both of those, and essentially, is supposed to be updating the documents over time, and the developer themselves, excuse me, the intention is that the developer themselves would actually be, updating things like the user manuals, and then, the owner would basically be ensuring that that is being properly updated and is readable.
Do you have a formalized SLA for that? Like,
We do not.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, that's not poking holes.
No, we don't have any sort of SLAs or really any sort of even formal type of documentation review. I think those are things that we're probably going to have to incorporate in the future. So project level. So this is essentially taking the element level, but any sort of the elements that work together and form a function, right? So the architect is essentially supposed to evaluate whether or not it's functioning and if it's performant and scalable, right? That's Ben's job. That's what Ben does here at Decisions. He needs to make sure that the flows and everything that's being built is performing its function, but also doing it in a performant way. We typically do this weekly to twice a month. It really depends on the level of user who is developing. So it depends on how senior your developer is. If they're junior, we typically like to do it more frequently, but if they're senior, there's a lot more trust. We know that they can build it, and we do it less regularly. But what we are checking when we do these reviews are things like, are our dashboards running in a performant way, right? We have a lot of UI in the applications that we're building. So one of the things that we have to do is make sure that if there are 50 users, using our application, that the dashboards are being loaded in an efficient way and not taking 10 minutes. Other things, case process folder transitions for stateful processes, whole functions, right? Looking at the case from start to finish, looking if the functional decomposition encompasses, the whole of credit scoring, for example. But also making sure technical diagrams are updated and maintained.
Yeah. So just very quickly again, this is thinking back to the topology. This is one of those bite-sized chunks of those functionalities. And on top of that, just to follow up on what Elise said, is a lot of you who are more experienced developers in Decisions know that there's 5 ways to do anything in Decisions. That doesn't mean that all 5 ways are equal. In fact, very often of those 5 ways, something's more performant, something's more secure, something's more scalable, something's more maintainable. And you, as a architect or as an owner of this kind of code review, have to decide which of those things takes precedence. So you have to make a choice on not just what should be built, but how it should be built and why.
The next level up that we're going to talk about is the application level. So, the no-code reviews are intended to make sure that it's being built in the proper way. But this extra level, allows us to actually look at the application from start to finish. What we realized when working in 2-week sprints, right, we're reviewing and making sure that there's something demoable at the end. But what we weren't doing was looking at if the collection of sprints actually functioned the way we expect it to. So what we started doing was performing these kind of application level type meetings where we walk through the application from start to finish. And what it's allowed us to do is identify any sort of bottlenecks, but also any sort of things that we're missing, right? Did the product owner, give us the right requirements and the right vision to be able to build what we have so far? So it also allows us to kind of plan for our sprints ahead of time as well. We can see what else needs to be built and incorporate that within the backlog. We do this every 4 to 8 sprints. It really just depends. But really, it's every couple of months, right? 4 to 8 sprints, 2-week sprints, total to a couple of months.
And actually on top of that is thinking back a little bit to how our cycle works for our project management. We have business reviews every sprint. And so we have our product owners and our stakeholders a little bit more on board than probably most teams get to have them. So this is going to actually happen pretty often where we say, let's go ahead and take a look at the full end-to-end application, or let's go ahead and look at this full piece of functionality and get their feedback much more frequently than most teams probably get to.
We're going to move to application testing. Just doing a time check, we have 11:35, Ben.
Okay. Yeah, there's definitely no time for that.
We will not be covering Fred the Flow.
Yeah, go ahead and show Fred the flow. Okay, no, it's fine. So You guys aren't gonna get to experience it. Go ahead, Dak. Let's.
Okay, you could just tell the summary, okay?
Yeah, I'm just gonna give the summary, quick summary. So, you guys aren't the first group, so you didn't get to hear the story. I'm sorry, there's just not enough time. It takes 10 minutes to tell the story of Fred the Flow and his fearless trek up Production Mountain, out of Development Village.
On his journey to acceptance.
On his journey to acceptance. And how he gets assaulted by bugs on the way. And he's trying to scale the mountain, and he's got his load, and guys, it's a brilliant story. Please buy it on Amazon. I desperately need the money. But we're not going to cover it here today. We don't quite have time, but...
So we'll just move to unit testing.
We're just going to move to unit testing. All right. So this is something Decisions does really well, unit testing. And the reason is because it's got some capabilities built right into the tool that help you do it. So a unit test you can think of as, hey, I have some input data. I want to execute it against my configured elements, and then I want to check the output and validate it and make sure that it's doing what it's expected to do. So in Decisions, whenever you're creating a flow, whenever you're creating a rule, you can actually set up, you can debug, you can start putting in some input data. Oh, are they older than 18 years old? You put in a number, you say they're 5 years old. Well, you expect a false, if you're writing some simple true-false rule, you expect some false to occur. Great. When you input that data, you're able to save it off as a unit test that you can execute at some future point in time. And the best part about it is when you're using it in Decisions is Decisions has a business rules application. I mean, that's kind of the whole purpose of it. So not only can you create these unit tests, but also you can validate against them right then and there because they have associated rules connected to the unit test to validate the outputs. So at any point in time, whenever you deploy to a new environment, or you're regression testing because you've just updated your decisions from version 6.18 to 6.19, you say, let me go ahead and run all my unit tests and see if everything's working out great. And then you just execute them all from a functional perspective. You automate a big portion of your testing, and that's really the beauty of these unit tests. Let's also briefly talk about load testing. So you didn't get to hear about Fred's journey, how heavy his load was of trying to move up the mountain, but that's okay. Well, when you're load testing, you're really trying to simulate your production environment in your dev environment. You're trying to simulate the throughput that you would experience on a typical day in production. And so when you're doing your development work, you want to make sure that you're using tools like Gatling or JMeter in order to attempt to try that same throughput. Yeah, your flow's built well, it functions. You know, if I run through, the logic's great. But then if I have 20 users or 50 users using flows on my server at the same time, I have them kick off different forms and different dashboards. Is it actually gonna function the way I expect it to on production, the way I anticipate on dev? So load testing is what we do, and we wanna make sure that it handles that strain under load and still responds very quickly. Something that many of you probably don't know is that the profiler is a tool in Decisions that we can go to that is always running. So the profiler essentially captures a stack trace of everything that's executing in Decisions at any point in time. So it's always running. It's got a 20-minute capture period. So if I go create a rule and I go and I try to run it and it takes 12 seconds to execute, I say, wow, that's really weird. It should have been pretty instantaneous. Or I go try to fetch data and it takes 25 seconds. Or I try to go do this or that or send an email. If I get confused and I say, this really isn't performing the way I expected to, the profiler is your ideal tool to try to figure out why those technical bottlenecks are occurring. So you would swing over to the profiler, and on the profiler, again, it has a big report where you're able to drill down into that stack and see what methods are being executed, how long they're taking, and how often they're occurring. And that way, you have the ability to quickly try to find those technical bottlenecks and deal with them appropriately, whether that means submitting a dev ticket to say, hey, I don't know why, but your send email step is taking 2 minutes to execute. Or it might be because you're actually kicking off some recursive function and you're hitting something 1,000 times when you expect to hit it twice. So the profiler helps you identify those issues. And on top of that, it already has a bunch of key performance indicators built into it so that you can go to the hot spots of where things are going slower than you expect them to be, just right from the get-go without necessarily having to do all that drill down yourself. This is something I want to, let me move away from the speaker. This is something I also want to address. When you're testing indecisions, the ideal scenario is to have real data backported to your development environment. The reason for this is twofold. Number one, again, the load testing was trying to simulate the data on your production environment in dev. Well, there's no better alignment of your data between dev and prod than actually pushing your prod data to dev. Now, obviously, this isn't something that everybody can do. When you're working in fintech or you're working in healthcare, a lot of the data is PII. It's personally identifiable information that you can't backport into your development for any number of reasons. Maybe your development environment isn't as secure as your production environment. Maybe you've got contractors working on your development environment that don't have the same compliance levels. There's plenty of reasons why you may not be able to fully use your production data in development, but even just scrubbing it and having something similarly aligning would be significantly better for your production environment. Not only because the truth is, if you can see the real production data in your development environment, you actually know the scale of that data, you know how much is actually flowing through it, what the throughput is, but also because you're going to be able to catch things that fall through the cracks a lot of times when you're developing. Maybe you're creating reporting and you don't realize that in production, you've got this whole big report of data and it doesn't actually look quite right. Maybe a field that you expected to take 20 characters is actually taking 180 characters. And it's just chopping off a bunch of useful information that somebody who's an end user might really need. Well, you're never gonna catch that if you're making 10 simple use cases and just filling it with exerty, like just
Test,
Bob
testy.
test McTester. Yeah, you're never going to catch stuff like that, really, unless you backport your production data. So it helps you be proactive in trying to catch things that negatively impact your user's experience.
Oh, my
that's,
bad.
that's fine. And then we also want to briefly talk about automated UI testing. This isn't something that Solutions has actually done yet. This isn't something that we've tried yet. Now, I will say Decisions does this. Whenever we create a new build of Decisions, we use Selenium to be able to do some automated testing to go through the UI, the dashboards and forms for some smoke tests so that we can go ahead and do a quick, we can automate a lot of the work to find out whether or not these user interfaces are being rendered correctly. It saves an enormous amount of time that would otherwise be required to manually go through all these dashboards and forms and just visually check whether or not they're rendering. This is something we intend to incorporate on the solutions team once our testing suite is more robust. But yeah, it's going to be significantly faster and cheaper than trying to have all these things manually tested.
So last but not least, we're going to talk about process abstraction and how we utilized it here at the solutions engineering team. So Jason did talk about this yesterday for data-driven design. He talked about even the how of data-driven design. We're just going to focus on a few of the examples and some of the wireframes that we have for Tomato. Now, for process abstraction, I just want to point out and remind you guys, or if you weren't at the breakout session yesterday, what data-driven design or process abstraction is, right? It's allowing it's allowing you to have more control to a person like a process admin, right? Someone who is not trained in decisions, right? Someone who doesn't know how to edit flows or rules. And giving them and empowering them with forms and UI to make adjustments to the settings. So again, it's giving them the need or the ability to make adjustments to variables and settings without having to go into the flow or rule designer. I think this is something that really anybody can take away from the decisions days breakout sessions and start to utilize within their application, small or large. But here's an example of process abstraction. So what we did and what we are doing here is with loan origination, right, in the whole underwriting sector, there's rules that are governing or rules to weight different scoring for the risk of a borrower. So if somebody's being lent a loan, we need to identify how risky it is to lend them some money. So we have a mechanism where you can author rules or you can modify these things in an easier experience, right? So you don't see the decision studio. This is really just a dashboard created so that you can change some of the metadata for a set of rules in this case. So you'll see things like the report viewer, where you can make changes to the weights, even do things like create a rule, right? Something you're not seeing here that you would see in the studio, right, is things like just one button for create rule. So in this case, we just have a single button to create a single type of element. Into the decision studio, you would see create flow, create rule, create report, create dashboard, create data type, right? There's so many different options, but we're making it a lot easier for a user to interact with some of these elements and really focus on the things that they need to do instead of trying to figure out how to learn the product. Another example we have is a settings wizard or a process wizard. So here in this example, Tomato is being designed with many different customers and many people in mind, right? There's not a single customer that we're building for. So we have to think about the things that our customers, our many customers, will want to adjust and change, and do that without being trained in the decisions environment. So what this is an example of is plugging and playing authentication, for example, for an API call. So you can turn on an authentication or an integration to things like Equifax and just put in your authentication information. So this is not the end user putting in information. This is the process admin entering in information who has permissions for this form, this UI. We're also doing things like email templates, terms and condition, even things like tasking and error handling as settings that you can modify and change within the applications. So those are just to name a few.
And just to reiterate again, that's all done through decisions forms. You don't have to know how to open up a flow, go in, edit it, or into a rule. You just do it straight from a form experience where we've set up kind of this little layer around the things you might want to modify.
Well, I think quick time check, but we're a little bit over, but that kind of concludes it. We have some other things that, we were maybe going to cover if we didn't talk enough, but I think we did plenty of that today. So we're not going to cover these, but there's going to be so many more things that we learn as we create these applications, and hopefully we'll be able to share those things with you in the future. But any questions? Yes?
The last two UIs you showed, those are not the content, but those are part of standard decisions.
The tools that we're using to create this sort of interface is decisions. So we're using the forms designer, the page designer to create that look and feel. Let me see if I can't get to the end of it. So this is just a wireframe that you see. We are working currently on the actual product. But yes, this would be a decisions form. It would essentially have, we'd be using the different components in the form designer to create this.
And the previous one, they just see that again?
This one, yes.
Yeah, so those are standard decisions UIs, you just have to use them.
Right. For example, this is a tab container. This would be a report viewer, a button, right? This would be our report viewer, but a different type of view that we're utilizing.
And then one question for partner in crime. In the documentation, you're featuring requirements, but as you know, traditionally it's been developers. I'm wondering if decision had built in, well, the first thing you mentioned at the element level, names, and then documentation narrative, those canned parts of the development tools, do we have a standard for what a name should look like?
Yeah, so different teams take on their own different naming conventions. For the solutions team, we have created a naming convention that we like. Obviously, different developers like different things. They like going, oh, well, we like camel case, or we like Pascal case, or blah, blah, blah. We on the solutions team have decided on how we want naming conventions to be. And then also professional services also has their own best practices where they follow a very similar paradigm and also have their own set of particular standards that are just slightly different from our own.
Yeah, we are working with the decisions developer community to kind of get synced up on that so that we're not all doing separate things and we're all going to be aligned on a singular. But that's the hope for the decisions developer community.
So for the standard testing or validation routines, are you allowing stuff to go forward without element names, without documentation and functions?
When we do our no-code reviews, we explicitly look for that to make sure that when our developers are developing our solutions, that we do not allow that. Now, out of the box, there's no initial default validations that'll check to see whether or not step names are empty or anything like that. That's something that you would have to manually review. Yes, sir.
For this particular project, is it possible for you to say example of how you guys did this?
We might be able to do that, and we built a prototype, so we might be able to share, the structure of it.
Yeah, just I like the idea because I think patient wanted to just having all the ones on the left side and then actually expand it out to different pages, and then the actual form itself, it gives the user a lot more usability on a project. Naturally, like this layout.
Yeah, we can talk about that after the session.
Corey, did you have a question? I'm sorry, you looked like you raised your hand earlier.
I think that was Sam. Oh, what is it?
What is QOF?
Qoff?
So it says QOF scope and QOF
I think that's supposed to be O.
That's the
Like I said,
classic Elise.
wireframes. I didn't even notice that.
You've never heard of QOF? You're living in the Stone Ages.
It's new, up and coming.
How did you even see that? No. Sam, did you have a question?
No, I was just gonna talk to his question about documentation. Flow itself has documentation, a place for documentation about flow, and then you're able to drag labels and things, rich text labels out of the step toolbox. So if you wanted to explain inside of the flow, I'm using this step here because of X, Y, and Z, like you would in regular code, you can do that. But there's
And
not
also,
really force
something that we talked about the last session was there is an export of a project that was built by one of our PS developers. And basically what it does is it creates a button on a folder where you can click generate documentation, and it'll create one big document of all the elements in the folder and give you, things like a screenshot of what it looks like, description, inputs, outputs, things like that. So if you're interested in that, you can talk to Noah at the front desk. Oh, wait, there he is. There he is, in the flesh. Yeah, you were hiding behind Dale. Oh, yes.
Going along with what Sam said, do you guys have an example of like a flow header right now that you guys use?
We don't. No. Yeah, I think we scrapped that, the flow header stuff, but
I'm actually using it on all of my flows.
just don't put any images in there. When you go from environment to environment, it can be, yeah. For example, we created, I think it was the import-export wizard, and I used one of the templates, because the import-export wizard is actually a flow. We made some modifications to it in 7, but we had headers with images in them, and basically when we exported it, it was referencing an environment.
I see.
Yeah, so just be careful with that. Yeah.
I haven't seen any issues from
Oh, good.
Are you using it all?
Pravash Well, thanks for attending. Hopefully you guys learned something new, and yeah, thank you.